Dave Brown and Jane Covey are here with us from the United States of America. They together started IDR in the 1980s, shortly after spending a year working on development projects in India. By that time, they had considerable graduate education, law and organizational behavior for Dave, psychiatric nursing, and business administration for Jane. A decade of work experience spanning Peace Corps, community organizing, university teaching, and organizational consulting for David, and nursing, public health, university teaching, organizational consulting for her as well. They are proud parents to two children. They had met as graduate students, soon started working together as action researchers, married in 1969, moved to Cleveland so Dale could teach in Case Western Reserve University in 1971. And they have been friends of Priya, and Dr. Rajesh Tandon frankly and very fondly recollects and says this out aloud, that Dave is his guru. So all of us who've looked up to Dr. Tandon, it is a great opportunity for us today to hear how they embarked on this journey to strengthen organizational development and organizational processes in support organizations all around the world. But before we go there, we will start with the format today. We have a session where we ask both of them a few questions, to be like frank, 5 to 6 questions, which are going to be interactive. The objective of this is to take us back in history, to give us a snapshot of how they embarked on this journey, connecting how they have connected with Priya and the history of Priya all this while. After each question and the responses, we will request the participants around the table to ask questions and make their comments to take the discussion ahead. Alright? So without further ado, I shall begin my questions. Great. Given that both of you have a background in management studies, what is it that inspired you to work towards strengthening human and institutional capacities of NGOs, starting from the 1980s?
Well, for me it started a little earlier than that, because when I graduated from college, I had the options of going to graduate school or joining the Army so I could fight in Vietnam, or finding a job, none of which seemed like attractive options. But it was just at that time that Kennedy had started the Peace Corps. So I went off to Ethiopia as a community organizer for a couple of years in rural Ethiopia, which was quite different from Boston, where I went to college, in some ways. In other ways, it was, people aren't that different across lots of different situations. And I ended up having a lot of close friends in Ethiopia and getting a sense that if we could change some things, a lot of people would have many more options in their lives and it would be a fairer world. And I grew up in a family that was concerned about fairness. And so when I came back from Ethiopia, I, partly on the basis of advice from colleagues in the Peace Corps, went to law school, which turned out to be not a terribly good choice for me. In my first semester, I was in a small course on constitutional law, taught by a distinguished law professor, and in the first 2 weeks, I had a long argument with this professor about whether law was connected to justice. I was sort of under the impression that if it's not doing justice, what is it doing? And he made a serious effort to persuade me that lawyers, at least in the United States, are hired guns for the people that hired them. and that I should concentrate on being the best hired gun I could be. And I was persuaded that's what lawyers do, but I was not persuaded that's what I wanted to do. So I began to take courses in other departments and eventually found that I was very interested in organizational behavior, which led to finishing law school in a 4-year program that gave a master's degree in organizational behavior, and writing a thesis for the law school that didn't have the word law in it, and then sliding into a doctorate program from there to case Western Reserve. So it was a fairly odd sequence that led to this. Along the way, just about the time I had moved into the doctoral program, Jane and I met in a course, which was not in her department and not in my department. We were both sort of likely to go away from our departments. And that one thing led to another. 18 months later, we got married. So,
so for me, the graduate school was a place where I guess intellectually began to think about how is life better for people. When I was nursing, it was around health. How do you recover health, or how do you remain healthy? And it was very obviously individually focused. But when I was studying in graduate school, particularly in the community mental health area, having worked in that area for a year or so, I came to understand that the systems in the institutions of society have a lot to do with poor health, or good health, as it were. And my work had been within urban areas in the inner cities. And so began to say, if I'm going to make a contribution, where may I do that? So becoming associated with people in David's department and in the public health department who were working on institutional systemic issues affecting society, that moved me to think, okay, I want to work at a level beginning with group, but moving into institutions, so that perhaps that avenue will also contribute to health. And it was particularly, I worked with people in urban areas who were very poor, mostly African American people. So the history of the United States and its effect on a whole group of people struck me very deeply, and so that was part of where I was in my both sort of value system and intellectual system, and began to think that nursing was not the best place to do that. So I essentially got an MBA simply to get a different credential, to open up other options, with no particular. One thing I did know was I wasn't interested in working for corporate America. Actually, I ended up doing that for a short while as a consultant around affirmative action, around gender issues in corporations, and really learned again that I did not want to work for corporate America. And it was about that time we'd come back from being here in India and had chosen not to go back to Cleveland because David was more committed to doing this social change work than he had been, having had the experience here. So we moved to Boston, and after a couple of years of doing consulting, I joined David in the notion that we should work at IDR together and see what could happen with that. So,
you all mentioned a year in India.
yes.
So which year was that, and what did you do when you came to India for that year?
So that was 1979-80. And we were here on a Fulbright, and our host institution was the Public Enterprises Center for Continuing Education, which had been started by Nitish Day who had known Rajesh from IIM Calcutta. And he knew me because one of his colleagues was the chair of the department at Case Western Reserve. And they, I think, conferred and said, I was coming up for a sabbatical year, and I think they conspired to say, let's get into India somewhere. And they also conspired, I think, to hire Rajesh. So Rajesh had started up already at Pecky, and I arrived on the scene, and we did quite a lot of co-conspiring while we were at Pecky together. And that involved both workshops and consulting with public enterprises, and also some research. So I ended up doing some research on under what circumstances do public enterprises contribute to community development in their regions. And at that time, Rajesh was experimenting with doing all sorts of big development projects with funding from international foundations. So I think both of us at that point began to think, maybe there's a way we can apply this organization theory and organization development stuff to the problems of development, professional and social and economic development.
And for me, I came in finding a role, having just come out of the MBA program, and I wouldn't say having any new skills, having some new training. So I ended up not having professional work. And as we were here, and David and I began to talk about what will we do next, and it was clear that going back to Cleveland was a couple of things. For David, that wasn't the appropriate thing to do. For me, if we came back, I would start some kind of career trajectory, and I wouldn't be ready to leave in 6 months or a year. So we had lots of conversations and decided to move to Boston. So essentially, the children and I were the what do they call it in campaigns? The forward team. The ones that went to see what could happen. It happened to be 1980. We were in a recession. Everybody in Cleveland thought we were absolutely nuts, crazy, insane to make this change. And so finding a job was not an easy prospect, but I ended up working for a small consulting firm that was one of the earliest working on gender equity affirmative action in U.S. corporations at a time when if they were working, if the organization was doing anything about it, it was under duress because they'd been sued in a class action suit. So that was, I was just starting that work when then you came at the end of 12 months.
I remember saying to Jane, leaving Case Western Reserve is crazy. I have tenure. I will have a job, we'll have an income. We have 2 little kids. Going off into outer space without having any job or income, etc., is nuts. And she said, well, not knowing about the 1980 recession at the time, you can wash dishes. And I said, well, yes, because I was the dishwasher in our household. So, so you find a job washing dishes?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's a relief. But it was, I think, an unwise decision in terms of rationality about one's career, and a terrific decision in terms of energy about what I was doing. Because I was pretty bored in Case Western Reserve, and helping the Northeast Ohio corporate community become better was not a vision that made my blood run hot. So we ended up being very pleased about the decision to move to Boston, but I have to tell you that I discovered in the 6 months after we moved there that if you were meeting new people at a cocktail party, it was better to describe yourself as a consultant than as unemployed. You describe yourself as unemployed, people want to get to talk to somebody else.
I want to make a comment here because this conversation, of course, takes me to my memory lane. Two things. One was the big turtle project that Dave mentioned. That was my first sort of in that PhD program, there was considerable emphasis on professional development, not just academic. We were asked to take the qualifying exam, write a research paper, write a theoretical paper, all that. But also we were assessed on our professional skills. How do we undertake a consulting project? How do we do facilitation of groups, etc.? So when I worked with Dave and a couple of other colleagues in that project, was the first time that we really got to work together. And that experience had one lesson, which I still remember, that before you judge a situation, read the data carefully. And by virtue of my upbringing, maybe Indian's upbringing, maybe the kind of academic training I had at IIM or whatever, I had a tendency to judge and then read the data. And I still remember that Dave would push us with, well, let's see what the data says. Okay, this is what the data says, analysis says, let's stay with this. In addition, we can judge, these people are stupid, no problem. That is the great learning. And those of us who work with a commitment for change can sometimes cloud our understanding, confuse our understanding. Our standpoint, our commitment is important, but if the data says that this set of officials is not corrupt, we don't have to say you are corrupt. The second thing it did was that when I wanted to come back and do my fieldwork in India, I requested Dave to join my committee. Because I was Indian, because I was the first Indian in the program as a doctoral student, and because the chair of the department was an Indian, a former professor of IIM Calcutta, a great friend of my director and all that, he assumed that he will be chair of my committee. And that was the best decision I ever made in my life, was to ask him to be a member of the committee. And the seeds of setting up something, because I used to tell him that what I really want to do is not happening here, is public enterprises. Yeah, we are doing it, but they're not committed for community development, and it's not satisfying and all that. And he was, he told us what he was feeling dissatisfied with as well. So, and within 2-3 months of his return, we had the first founding meeting of PRIA in, I think, July or August of 1980 with Walter Fernandez, Anita Dige, and Prem Chadha.
Okay.
And Prem Chadha was in Peki, and I had started working with him. He was much senior to me. But when Dave came to Peki in the Fulbright, then 3 of us worked together on several projects and became good friends as well. So Prem was also instrumental in getting PRIA off the ground, and he once remarked in our, I didn't realize till he remarked that that's what he felt all along, he once remarked that he encouraged me to set up Priya because he thought it is a fad Rajesh had for 4 or 5 years. And he felt affectionate towards me. So he remarked in 2002, the 20th anniversary program in Habitat Center, that I later on realized that he was more serious than that, and he's still continuing to do Priya. So we became very good friends. And why I'm saying this is that, you know, when you take these decisions about, you know, as they did, you know, forget your zone of comfort, your tenured position, your familiarity in the context, and move to something new, friendships matter. Relationships.
Over that decade, spanning from the mid-80s to 90s, both of you engaged in building capacities of southern NGOs. Priya was on the board, was inducted by World Bank as in the committee, and Dr. Tandon led that whole process. So can we take a snapshot back and understand why at that period it was important to work on building capacities of these support organizations per se?
Priya and IDR began working with support organizations from a number of countries in the region. And I think given our background in organization development, which really grew up mostly in corporate, we thought organization development made a lot of sense for NGOs. There were lots of NGOs starting at that time, many of them by people who knew something about the focus they were working on and nothing about management or strategy or how do you build a big organization from your initial 3 people. So beginning to think about how do you adapt ideas from management from corporate management to the challenges of NGOs and movements was both interesting and not done. And IDR at that moment, IDR started, our first project was to evaluate a series of interventions in cities that I had been involved with to try and build leadership networks in Cleveland. Our second project was a joint project with Priya to look at public health in India. IDR at that point did a series of case studies fostered by Jane, who said, we ought to do these things, whether or not we can get funding for it, because nobody knows how to deal with these kinds of problems. So we did a series of case studies, and then wrote a paper about the management challenges of NGOs, development NGOs, which got published just about the time AID began to say, you know, we ought to be thinking about the organization of some of these civil society organizations. Who's doing something about that? The answer to that question is practically nobody, but there's this little organization in Boston that's been writing stuff about managing NGOs. So all of a sudden we had these people knocking on our door saying, we want to give you money. And we sort of said, money? What's that?
He said that.
We had an MBA on the staff, luckily, who said money is the source of life. And I'm not exactly sure what the timing was, but at the same time, we began jointly writing with Priya a series of papers about support organizations and what is their role and how can they carry out those roles in different areas in several different South Asian countries. I guess the other thing to say is action research and participatory research was another area that we worked on. I was up to my ears in the action research tradition in the US, which was working with corporate communities. Rajesh was up to his ears in the participatory research. And we sort of banged heads about what are the differences about, or the similarities. And ended up sort of looking at the literature and finding there's a literature for participatory research and there's a literature for action research, and they don't recognize each other. They don't cite each other. That's ridiculous. So we wrote a paper basically saying, this is ridiculous, you ought to be talking to each other. That led to a lot of the participatory action research stuff.
I think that from my perspective, at the time we began to collaborate, the period that David just talked about, there was a upwelling of civil society organizations globally. 89, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, etc. There was this opening that hadn't been there. And from the point of view of for us, Americans, there was a assumption, USAID, some of the foundations, not all of the foundations, most of the extant INGOs, was that we were going to go around the world and tell everybody how to manage themselves better. And I think we were very fortunate from our history and from our values and from particularly our association with Rajesh and with Priya to say, no, that is not appropriate. That it continues a history that has proven to be not so effective. And that if we at IDR are going to make a contribution, better that we work with organizations like Priya, support organizations to local and state and regional organizations, rather than try to build our capacity, our facility to go out and do it. And that's a debate and a struggle that continues, I have to say. So it positioned us, not that we were trying to position ourselves, but it was something that made IDR different than other U.S. agencies and organizations that were out to support civil society around the world. And it continues to be. It is, where does the primary locus for social change reside? Where does the primary knowledge and expertise for that particular situation reside? And what, if anything, can we do usefully to contribute to that? And I think what we learned and what we tried to practice over the years was that we could bring external perspectives, offer them, and in dialogue with folks here at Priya and other institutions say, okay, what of this, if any, makes sense to you? And how do you adapt it and make it work for you? And in the process, we learned so much more, which we could then take back and put into the work that we did. And I think that probably one of the biggest contributions that we were able to make at IDR was through David's ability to synthesize a lot of that and to write it and to create theory out of practice. And just a little side thing, one of my most important learnings when I was in graduate school in nursing was from two philosophers who developed the notion of practice theory, as opposed to there's theory and there's practice, and they really don't have a lot to do with each other, and legitimize practice theory. That is not all deductive, but inductive makes a lot of sense. So I think our contribution ultimately was to whatever exists in the world now. We had some small contribution to make to that.
Is it unique to the two of you that you never worried about funding? You started IDR and never worried about funding, because that is the big debate and has been for the past 10 years at least since I've been associated with this sector. That how do you fund organizations? Where is the money going to come from? How do you sustain an organization if people are not willing to fund you? So, are you the outliers, or are you? As you said, nuts, or what is it that didn't worry you? And why is everybody so worried today?
Okay, today is different than 1980, very different. And when we began, our work at IDR was preceded by our willingness to go somewhere else without jobs and to take the risk of whatever happens, we'll be okay. So it's a strangeness within us that prevailed. But the other was, in the early days, David was working full-time at Boston University at that point, so we had a basic income. We could support ourselves as a family. That our assumption was, because we were doing something new to us and it turned out to be new to others as well, is that we had to start small and we had to build. So our first grant that supported those case studies was $5,000. Yeah, and that was big. That was a big deal. That was a big deal. And IDR was always very small, very modest. We had a small core staff, and we had associates that worked, so we were able to from a institutional organizational point of view, be flexible. We bring people in to do various work, and when that was ended, it was like a project-based as opposed to institution-based funding. And it's not that we didn't worry about funding. We didn't worry about paying people's salaries. We didn't worry about being able to continue what we were doing. But that wasn't the primary thing. And there were a few, but not many, projects that we took that took us off course from the mission and the values. And the challenge, I think, is to how do you, and that was there then and is even more so now, how do you pursue a mission with integrity, and where do you take on work that isn't precisely what you would want to do, but at least is within the mission of what you're about. But I think we were privileged in a way that there was funding coming to do what we wanted to do at that time, what our mission was about. That wave of funding was pretty much over by the time we got into the 2000s. And the funding situation was different. And what happened was that when it became more challenging to do the work, one of those challenges was a positive change in that more of the funding was coming to the PRIAs and to the others. And our role as that intermediary wasn't as necessary as it had been 20 years earlier. So the sense was, okay, what is an appropriate role? What does it look like? And that became quite unclear in the early 2000s. So we were able, at that point in time, to say, okay, the work that we're doing can continue through David's work. He had by that time going to Harvard, where he could integrate the academic and the social change work. And to keep an institution going for the sake of its going doesn't make any sense. Just, whatever we have done, we were there at a moment in time where what we were about and what the world was looking for coincided, and it has changed. And so when we were at one small moment in history, the experts in the world on NGO management, everybody was doing NGO management. All the academic institutions, the consulting firms, the whatever. So it's not that we were never concerned about it. It was my job to be concerned about it and to say, oh my God, what do we, How are we going to go for the next 6 months? What's the income going to look like? But I think that part of now that makes it more challenging for all NGOs is those other actors are involved, so to speak, in doing civil society development or social change work. And governments are, at least our government, is a lot less willing to invest. The philanthropic community continues to shift and change and move for all kinds of unclear reasons. So I'll stop.
I also wanted to know that prior to 2000s, in the formative years of ITR, what was the kind of funding you were receiving? Where were these funds coming from? And as you said that currently, even in India, the government is not very receptive towards such work. So back then, what was the government like?
Well, most of our funding came from private foundations. The Ford Foundation was a major donor. MacArthur Foundation at one point. And that was very fortunate because working with those institutions, there was a lot more flexibility. They said, okay, what our strategy or what we're about and what you're about are together. In the 90s, we began to work with USAID. To some extent, that was similar, but it began to change as we were working with aid over that decade. But I think the more sustainable at the time was the private foundation funding. And the challenge when we began to work with USAID, I'm thinking of the instance of the work in South. Well, no, the challenging part. In South Africa, there were a lot more politics involved with USAID. There was a project which had done some pioneering work in Botswana, was it? Zambia. And it had gone very well, and USAID wanted to scale it up. And the unfortunate thing was they chose to work with a historically black college for political reasons to work in Zambia, who had no capacity whatsoever. They were unwilling to work with us from Boston. You gotta be kidding me, you know? You're at Alabama? No, I don't think so. And so it was a lesson for me in that is much more politicized money from the point of view of having the grant to do it, but from the point of view of doing the work as well. And that became challenging.
So one of the things that struck me as you were talking is I think some of what IDR became was good judgment, and some of it was luck. And I mentioned earlier our doing the sort of studies of these, what we call empowerment NGOs, that led to us being visible because there wasn't anybody who knew anything about managing those things or who was running about them. But we also at that point talked to the Ford Foundation about what became the Leadership Fellows Program, the Asian NGO Leadership Fellows Program, which was a 5-year grant from Ford to run a program each year that would bring leaders, sort of the leading leaders of the NGOs in 6 countries in Asia to Boston for a month to reflect on what their strategies were, where the sector was going in their countries, and so on. And we got that grant in part because we were associated with PRIA, and PRIA had a good reputation with the local Ford Foundation. And we also talked with Rajesh and his colleagues there a lot about who might we get from India, who should come from Bangladesh, who should come from Thailand, etc. But from the point of view of IDR's credibility, when that program took off and became got a good reputation as being helpful rather than Americans telling people what to do. We suddenly had a network in Asia of key people who would say, yes, let's get IDR to come help do this. So, as Jane said, we were never a big organization. We had a lot of high-quality associates who were consultants or faculty at various universities who worked for IDR when we had the money to hire them at cut rates. But they felt like, oh yes, this is an interesting thing to do when I'm not getting big dollars from corporations. So, for one reason or another, we had a network both among the sort of OD people in the US and among the NGOs in Asia and elsewhere that let us make proposals and do things that would have been very difficult for others to do. And part of it was also we were snooty. We were invited at one point to get a grant from USAID in the Philippines that would have more than doubled our income for the next several years. And they said, and by the way, we don't want you to work with these organizations that we've heard you were connected to, which were the sort of left-wing NGOs in the Philippines. And we said, huh? And they said, we don't think you should work with them. And we said, we won't use your money to work with them. And they said, no, we don't want you to work with them at all. And we said, sorry, thank you very much. We don't need your money that badly. But that was, I think, it was important for us to be clear about what our priorities were in this work.
In 1984, in Priya, we did the first workshop on financial management of NGOs. And we had two kinds of reactions. The first reaction was from grassroots organizations who began to say, oh, why do we need to worry about financial management? We are non-profits. The second reaction was from those who said, these are some management upstarts who have come around here. And they're trying to teach us a lesson or two. I think what your story of that period suggests is that in the mid-80s, the work that Dave and Jane were doing and the work that we were doing was ahead of the curve. And it was ahead of the curve from two very important standpoints. First was that institutional capacity, leadership capacity, management capacity for social change organizations would be necessary to sustain your impact. And even the most progressive international supporters did not believe in this. They said, wow, you do some good today here, tomorrow you open your tent, go somewhere, etc. And there was resistance to that notion. And the word management particularly was seen as smelling of corporate, because the rest of us mismanage anyway. So the second standpoint, which I think is very important, is that the role that Dave and Jane and other colleagues at IDR took was exceptionally anti-colonial in its intellectual position. Because one of the first international non-profit management programs came from Manitoba Institute of Management. I think we still have their training manual somewhere. And Manitoba Institute of Management, and then several others followed, essentially sold North American practices, structures, belief systems as if they will work everywhere. The approach that IDR took was distinctive in saying we do have some knowledge, but our knowledge is contextual. We believe these ideas of strategic thinking and leadership may be relevant, but we don't know how they will apply in your context. So let us explore it together. And a related thing which is important to remember is that because you took a position, IDR took a position, Priya took a position that we want to strengthen capacities at local level, human and institutional capacities. We are careful that we don't do anything which weakens that capacity. And one way you weaken that capacity is by opening your shops around the world. IDR had the possibility, as you heard, to open offices around the world. They would have opened up in Philippines, an office in India, Bangladesh, Zambia, Botswana, wherever else. And they would have done management training and leadership training for non-profit sector worldwide. In the process, they would have displaced Priyas of this world. And this is a lesson for Priya to keep doing. Because we could go in some place and do things in a way that undermines our work in strengthening local capacity. Because ultimately, the process of change will depend on local initiative, local capacity, local leadership. Others of us can play a supportive role. So this is a very important issue. If you see in the last 8-10 years, how proliferation of international organizations opening shops around the world has happened, and how those shops, the size of that shop shifts with the nature of international systems. So the bigger shops in Africa right now than they are in Asia or Latin America. And sooner there will be bigger ones in Syria and the Mediterranean, so that those people don't migrate to Europe. So this is an important issue because we could perpetuate colonial practice by saying we have the answers, we have the expertise, we'll tell you how you do it.